Boa tarde. Vim cedo demais, estava só a testar aqui o sistema. Não sei se me estão a ouvir.
Deixa de testar, estás bem.
Ok.
Deixa de testar, estás muito bem.
Muito bem, então eu vou esperando. Obrigado. Boa tarde. Vim cedo demais, estava só a testar aqui o sistema. Não sei se me estão a ouvir. Boa tarde. Ok.
Deixa de testar, estás muito bem.
Muito bem. Fizemos tudo o mesmo.
Esta é a ação que está bem. Então deve estar a chegar, eu fico preso nos.
Não tem como estava aí a informação.
Testar aqui o sistema. Não sei se me estão a ouvir. Boa tarde. Ok. Sim.
Está bem.
Muito bem. Fizemos tudo o mesmo.
Quem é que está lá? Quem é que faz bom?
Não.
Então deve estar a chegar, eu fico preso.
Estava aí a informação.
Posso ver ali? O YouTube já está. Só está atrasado.
Verifica um pouquinho depois.
Luís, o YouTube está um bocadinho atrasado em relação ao Zoom. Por isso é que nós ouvimos às vezes repetido.
Mas já tiramos.
Mas agora já não ouvimos mais. O YouTube está a funcionar.
O YouTube atrasa sempre em relação ao Zoom, não há problema.
Sim.
Ok? Please. Ok? Ouviste o que eu disse, Adolfo?
Sim. Nós ouvimos, professor. Nós ouvimos. O YouTube tem sempre um delay, é normal.
O que nós não podemos é ter o YouTube ligado na mesma sala em que estão os microfones, senão... Quer dizer, podemos ter o YouTube ligado, mas sem som.
A duplicação aqui é porque o YouTube efetivamente estava com som para fazermos o teste, mas ele começou aqui a replicar já.
Não, tranquilo, sim. Pois, vocês sabem isso, não é? Eu estou aqui a ensinar a missa ao vigário, mas pronto.
Olha, foi o Miguel Faria, mandou-me agora um SMS, dizendo que vai tentar ainda aparecer, mas está num colóquio em Coimbra, para eu justificar a ausência dele.
O Miguel Faria,
Sim.
que está na A3ES?
Sim.
Excelente.
E para eu justificar a ausência dele. Que ele está num congresso agora em Coimbra. Porque ele foi o nosso diretor no departamento de tempo. O Telmo diz, estou no comboio. Depois diz, a CP é uma lotaria. Depois diz, já estou...
Adolfo,
Diz.
estás-me a ouvir?
Estou.
Eu sugeria que nós falássemos em português na sessão de abertura. De uma forma geral toda a gente entende. Porém, como também teremos na abertura, pelo menos o Lawrence Strauss e provavelmente o John Crowley, mas o Strauss disse-me logo que estaria logo no início, para ir acompanhando e não sei o que mais, acho que vale a pena dizer uma frase em inglês, good afternoon ou qualquer coisa desse género, por uma questão de simpatia em relação aos colegas, mas depois falar em português, explicando que falamos em português nesta primeira parte da sessão, cujo resto será em inglês, quando forem as conferências. De acordo?
Ok.
Eu estou a tentar ligar para o João Croado, que ainda não me atendeu, mas é que nós estamos hoje com uma auditoria no IPT. Portanto, ele falou com os auditores para estar liberto naquele momento, mas eu queria lhe dizer também esta história.
Corretores. Como está?
Muito bom dia, Sr. Reitor, tudo bem?
Tudo bem? Olha, isto foi muito difícil. Eu tive que levar a minha filha do hospital. Mas já estou. A correr, nem sabia onde é que ia. Aterrei! Veio ali. Isto é em inglês?
Em português.
Depois deixe-me lá para os patrões.
Claro, para os conferencistas. Já está.
Eu já cá estou. Bem, este cá está mais fresco. 5 a 6 graus mais fresco.
Adolfo, eu peço desculpa, só mais uma questão que temos que não chegámos a ver exatamente, que é a tomada de palavra. E como está agora já o Sr. Reitor, não sei se não seria bom, não sei se o Sr. Reitor começa a falar logo ou se o Adolfo o introduz. Se calhar era bom o Adolfo introduzir para as pessoas saberem que é o Reitor da Universidade que vai falar.
Então online ainda mais razão para isso, não é?
O que não estou a ouvir bem.
Online ainda mais razão para isso. Quer dizer,
Pois.
Porque quando estamos todos, vê-se quem é, mas assim quem é.
Exatamente, exatamente.
O mestre de cerimónia sempre nestas coisas.
Portanto, era bom e acho que esta coordenação é melhor ser feita a partir daí, porque estão com todo o sistema centralizado aí, portanto, daí a minha sugestão de ser o Adolfo a fazer a apresentação de quem vai falar, primeiro sua, depois do João Croado, etc.
É o senhor Reitor.
Olha, o João está-me aqui a ligar.
João Croado.
Ok.
Croado. Depois sou eu. Depois o Telmo. Não, é Telmo. Depois do Telmo. O Fred. O Luís, fica depois do Fred, não é? Olá, Telmo, tudo bem? Poxa. Estamos sempre mandando e-mails para tudo. Isto não estava perfeitamente mal. Como diz, ela acabou de sair. Mas ela não recebeu. Não sabe nada. Como eu liguei, olá, tudo bom? Então, tudo bom? Tudo bem? Depois tem que eu ver o show depois. Ok. favor. Antes, estará o Sr. Reitor, depois o Presidente, vão falar. Depois eu vou dizer umas palavras também. Depois passo para o Telmo. Telmo, passo para ti. Depois de mim, ser eu, ficas tu. Depois o Fred, a fechar. E depois o Fred passa para o Luís. Miguel Faria mandou uma mensagem para não justificar a ausência dele. Está bem? Queres justificar tudo? Tem uma palavra, sim. Ok.
Eu peço desculpa, mas eu estou a ver em grande dimensão o site do doutoramento na UAL.
Está.
Isto é intencional?
É assim que arranca a sessão, sai essa imagem e entra a imagem de sala. Aliás,
O quê?
eu posso colocar já a imagem de sala e tudo. Aqui um segundo.
Pronto, é melhor, acho que é melhor assim, porque assim pode-se pôr o orador em grande dimensão e ver melhor.
Nós
Ok,
colocamos
eu vou aqui dizer às pessoas que estão a chegar para entrarem rapidamente e depois fechar a porta.
Antes da sessão formal, já cumprimentar o senhor.
Pois, eu só queria cumprimentar-vos, Sr. Reitor, bem disposto.
Sempre. Quando não tenho, pinto.
Muito bem.
Já sigo os sentidos que, pai, não vamos inventar novas.
Eu, por acaso, até podia pôr o fundo, mas não, assim está bem. Que é que eu estou numa sala ao lado da presidência e podia pôr o fundo do Politécnico de Tomar, mas assim está bem.
Boa tarde a todos. Boa tarde, senhor reitor, professor Telmo,
Boa
professor
tarde.
Henrique, Adolfo, professor Adolfo. Olá, professor Luís.
Muito boas tardes.
Tudo bem?
Eu vou...
Quantas pessoas estão a chegar aqui para atuar? Eu liguei para o Telmo ontem, não entendi. Eu fui lá ontem também ao gabinete dela. E disse depois quem estava lá para dar essa indicação à professora Telmo. Lá ontem. E telefonei e fui ao gabinete. Ok. Melhor, se calhar, dar-lhe um toque para ver se ela pode ir. Está presente. Queríamos que ela tivesse presente ao mais. Mas nós recebemos todos um e-mail para tudo.
Agora está bem. O Luís está a dar um concerto, é o maestro.
Estou aqui a orquestrar o nosso exército aqui com as pessoas do mestrado que estão cá.
Estou a ver.
E que eu estou a pedir para não fazerem barulho quando começar a sessão, porque senão vocês vão ouvir tudo o que eles fazem. Eu vou desligar o meu microfone e vou ligar o microfone da sala. Depois, só quando eu falar é que faço a troca. Estou aqui com 2 computadores. Vamos fazer assim.
Luís, eu não conheço, mas as meninas que eu estou a ver, a Roberta e a Vanessa, são nossas colegas.
São do doutoramento, são doutorandos do curso. Portanto, no Zoom propriamente dito estão professores e estudantes de doutoramento, ok? Depois há pessoas a seguir em YouTube, porque a sessão é pública. E depois há pessoas, no caso, comigo, como também há na sessão aí na UAL, mas comigo estão os nossos estudantes de mestrado a acompanhar também. Pronto. Vou desligar o meu microfone.
Não sei se já estão todos os alunos, se não estão. Quantas pessoas é que já estão presentes?
17, 18.
Sim, mas os alunos são 11. Não sei se estão todos presentes, daqui não consigo perceber.
Não. Contando com a número de pessoas que estão lá, parece que estejam. Pode ser que sim. Mas já está 19, já começa a aproximar.
Não, Luís, estás por aí? Luís? Pode chamar o professor Luís hoje também. Luís?
Sim.
Vamos iniciar? Não?
Sim.
Vamos iniciar?
Sim, claro.
Pronto. Então, muito boa tarde a todos. Vamos iniciar então esta nossa sessão solene de abertura do doutoramento. Antes de mais, eu gostaria de cumprimentar todos os presentes, em particular o Sr. Reitor, que nos dá o prazer e a honra de aqui estar presente e nos dará também algumas palavras. Também o Sr. Presidente do IPT, o professor João Croado, que nos honra também com a sua presença e que ficamos muito gratificados por isso. O nosso diretor do departamento, os nossos colegas, amigos e todos os professores. Eu vou dar, para não tardar, eu vou dar a palavra já ao nosso reitor para iniciar aqui as nossas hostilidades.
Eu não quero iniciar hostilidades, quero agradecimentos. Antes de mais, de maneira informal, gostaria de dizer que não é um pouco. Adolfo disse que era uma honra ter aqui, honra é minha, não é vossa. E pelo que significa este doutoramento. Mas deixa-me só primeiro comentar o professor João Croado, hoje tem pelo, não óbvio, mas tem que ser, porque nós estamos também num curso à distância. E, portanto, temos que respeitar os limites. E é exatamente por isso mesmo que eu queria, e só de cumprimentar também todos os colegas, particularmente os que mais se empenharam, que eu tive o gosto de acompanhar às vezes também, o diretor do departamento e tenho os coordenadores, e todos os docentes que vão participar, e obviamente, last but not least, os estudantes. Porque se há cursos devem ser universitários e dizem cada vez mais devem ser centrados nos estudantes. E se há cursos da cidade do estudante, é o doutoramento. Quem faz o curso é o doutorando. E nós vamos atrás deles, fomos capazes. Se eles forem capazes, arrastam-nos, não somos nós que levamos. E é bom que os orientadores percebam isso. O orientador tem que estudar que se farta, senão não orienta coisa nenhuma. Eu, portanto, fico muito espantado, como algumas vezes estão a orientar 9 teses ao mesmo tempo. Devem ser heróis do mar, como os antigamente. Mas eu queria dizer que o meu prazer estar aqui é particular por várias razões. Eu não vou dizer quantas são, porque os políticos dizem que são 3 e depois dizem 2 ou 5. Portanto, eu, para não arriscar, digo por várias razões. E assim estou contente. A primeira é a singularidade deste curso. É um curso que une o Politécnico, e agora universidades politécnicas, acabou-se a brincadeira, já terminal. Mas é um prazer fazer parceria convosco, e que nos honra muito pela vossa capacidade, e, portanto, a Universidade Autónoma, e para mim em particular, é uma singularidade que eu gostava de salientar. E a segunda, e foi incluída para a 3DS, que é outra singularidade. Bom, e depois, uma segunda outra, é que ser um curso à distância que nunca foi testado. Ou seja, nós temos em cima uma responsabilidade tremenda. Ou seja, os estudantes têm em cima uma responsabilidade tremenda. Eu sei que são os donos do doutoramento. Porque eles é que têm que reconstruir uma tese. E agora nós estamos aqui para os ajudar. Mas sim, nós estamos aqui para ajudar os doutorandos. Contem com o reitor da Universidade Autónoma para isso, para o que for necessário e para o que ele puder e souber. E dizer que este é um doutoramento numa área que tem sido esquecida, abandonada. Cada vez mais é curioso, muitas vezes são os próprios docentes, os próprios investigadores das áreas mais duras, que começam a perceber que lhes falta um apoio das áreas tradicionais, das ciências humanas, voltas, começam a sentir essa ligação. E talvez seja necessário nós lhe demos esse apoio com qualidade. Portanto, a nossa capacidade de ter qualidade é que vai impor ou não vai impor o curso. E, portanto, os estudantes, os orientadores, e o reitor também tem uma responsabilidade, não precisarem de mim, não nos passem um papel, eu cá estarei, não fazer mais do que isso, como o Presidente, e é que está também disponível para isso. E queria também salientar já agora os dois, o cuidado que tiveram na escolha dos dois oradores de hoje, que eu acho notáveis, os temas que foram escolhidos. Eu, infelizmente, tenho uma reunião às 15h30 e não posso assistir ao duelo, porque os oradores têm sempre questão de minhas juventude. E muito mais quando o João Gabriel a falar de sustentabilidade, que é uma coisa que está na moda, é uma coisa que eu não queria perder, coisa nenhuma. Portanto, depois espero que se me transmitam as vossas opiniões sobre isso e agradecer também a presença dos nossos convidados e, sobretudo, a vossa capacidade de ser convidado. Eu desejo as maiores felicidades neste curso, que no fundo é o sucesso do IPT e o sucesso da UAL e também o sucesso dos cursos em dados à distância. Doutoramento de dados à distância. Talvez sejam mais cautelosamente conseguidos, desde que nós saibamos aproveitar os momentos em que estamos longe e os momentos em que estamos perto. Para isso, os coordenadores e os docentes têm que perceber que o contacto é a distância, mas tem que haver sempre contacto. Muito obrigado pela vossa presença e por terem convidado.
Obrigado, Sr. Reitor, e com a sua... Obrigado pelas suas palavras, naturalmente, e com a sua autorização. Então, damos continuidade a esta sessão. Eu deixo a palavra com o Sr. Professor João Colado, Presidente do IPT.
Muito bem. Então, viva a todos. Este é digamos que é uma reunião que dá início a um projeto que começou há muito tempo. Nós ainda não sabíamos onde é que ia culminar. Começou há muito tempo as relações que nós temos, Instituto Politécnico, com a Universidade Autónoma, e estas relações, do meu ponto de vista, estão a decorrer muito bem. Termos um projeto desta importância em conjunto é o culminar do namoro, portanto, e é, digamos, um casamento anunciado que nós temos que respeitar e temos que fazer perdurar. Estas as minhas primeiras palavras, antes da saudação ao excelentíssimo Sr. Reitor, caro amigo, cumprimento também todos os nossos colegas, hoje aqui à volta, vamos dizer que à volta da mesma mesa estamos com, digamos, com o espírito de quem entrou numa casca de nós e almeja a globalização do planeta. Este é o meu sentimento quando estou nesta primeira reunião. As palavras para o Luís e o Adolfo, porque foram de alguma forma, enfim, os artífices que estiveram atrás de todo este empreendimento, e naturalmente uma saudação muito grande aos nossos estudantes. Eles sim vão ter que lavar o convés, levantar as velas, arriar as velas, certamente vão passar por muitas tempestades, vão passar por muitos momentos em que se vão fazer a pergunta: o que é que eu estou aqui a fazer? Nós aqui deste lado temos essa experiência e estamos aqui para mitigar essas sensações, porque nós próprios já passámos por elas. Portanto, faz parte do processo, e eu quero lembrar aqui que um doutoramento, mais do que investigar profundamente, mais que investigar com muita qualidade, é nós adquirirmos uma autonomia e uma perspectiva daquilo que nós estamos a fazer, que nos permite, a partir das ideias que vão surgindo, preparar novos projetos, novas ideias, novos empreendimentos, e o doutoramento é isso. Ou melhor, o sucesso de um projeto como o doutoramento que está aqui a iniciar é exatamente esse, é criar dinâmicas que permita chegar a outros projetos e permita transversalizar tudo o que for feito no âmbito dos temas que vão ser investigados. Segundo ponto é a mais-valia temática. É juntar duas instituições que têm tradição, quer nas humanidades, quer nas tecnologias, e eu vou incluir tudo isto no património, e é fazer desta ideia linhas de investigação que podem efetivamente dar aqui um upgrade, uma alavancagem a este projeto e às nossas instituições. E eu vou dizer às nossas instituições, naturalmente, olhando para o Politécnico de Tomar hoje, que com a Universidade Autónoma, com a parceria da Universidade Autónoma, nos vai permitir atingir as condições que nos permitirão no futuro, que está aí à porta, outorgarmos conjuntamente com a Universidade Autónoma este grau de doutor. Neste momento, a formalização para essa condição é apenas burocrática. Isto quer dizer que daqui a 6 meses, quando nós ressubmetermos o pedido da associação, é um documento, e esse documento permitir-nos-á consolidar o casamento. Digamos que é uma troca de alianças, não é? E isso é extremamente importante para a nossa instituição e creio que nos responsabiliza com a Universidade Autónoma para que este projeto seja muito acarinhado. Eu queria também dirigir-me novamente, e já me dirigi, aos estudantes, assim como o Sr. Reitor disse, os estudantes são absolutamente cruciais neste projeto abrangente. Eles vão ter, naturalmente, deste lado, um acompanhamento que lhes será dado. O nosso interesse é que o projeto se expanda, que o projeto seja um sucesso, mas, como eu dizia, há aqui um caminho também solitário, e esse caminho solitário, esse esforço, está praticamente só de um lado. Nós estaremos sempre disponíveis, é certo que temos aqui a condição da distância, mas eu vou voltar a lembrar, a condição da distância é para trabalhos, eu vou dizer, mais teóricos, mais, digamos que de orientação na leitura de temáticas ou de trabalhos que interessem para orientar os nossos estudantes, mas é absolutamente imprescindível depois a presença em laboratórios, a presença em campo, tudo depende do formato e dos temas das teses que vão ser seguidas, a presença em museus, todo esse trabalho vai ter que ser feito. Portanto, eu não sei, Sr. Reitor, isto não é bem um doutoramento à distância. Eu prefiro chamar-lhe um doutoramento híbrido, e híbrido dá para tudo. Dá até para a nossa aprendizagem, porque eu aqui estou a aprender como é que tudo isto funciona, e aliás, já digamos que o projeto mal começou e nós já temos ajustes para fazer. Já ouvi da parte, quer do Luís, do Adolfo, por intermédio do Luís, que há ajustes que vão ter que ser, entretanto, feitos para benefício, para melhorar a prestação de todos nesta demanda, neste projeto. Portanto, as minhas saudações a todos os presentes. I think we have some the presence of some key speakers of the next section, isn't it, Luís? No. Luís não nos está a ouvir. Okay. So we are. I want to say some words to our inviters. Welcome to our project. We are not physically in both institutions. I don't know if you are at Mação, Luís. I don't know if our inviters are there. Where you are. So welcome to our project. Luís, desculpa.
Yes, there are some colleagues present in the session.
There at Mação, ok. Bom, e resta-me concluir e já agora, como nós costumamos, vamos cruzar os dedos para que todo o processo corra como nós queremos que corra. Obrigado a todos e obrigado por todo o esforço que todos depositaram neste projeto. Vai ser um sucesso, certamente. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Professor.
Sr. Presidente, eu pedi a palavra só para dar mais um toque. Está de acordo?
Sim, muito bem.
Também consigo, porque não é um doutoramento à distância, é um doutoramento à distância. E como
é a distância, sim, a distância, tem razão.
Não diz qual é a distância.
Isso, de acordo.
Obrigado.
Obrigado, Sr. Reitor. Caros colegas, caros alunos, em particular os nossos alunos, a special thanks to Professor João Crowley and Lawrence Strauss for this your participation in this section. O Doutoramento em Património e Tecnologia e Território é um programa, como sabemos, de formação avançada e de investigação que partilhamos com o Instituto Politécnico de Tomar. Trata-se de um projeto que reforça, sem dúvida nenhuma, a nossa parceria e a colaboração de há muitos anos já e que desenvolvemos e nos empenhamos sempre em reforçar todos os dias. Uma primeira palavra, necessariamente para os nossos alunos. São muito bem-vindos à nossa academia. Começando por dizer que lhe colocamos grandes expectativas e que os iremos apoiar para que atinjam necessariamente os seus objetivos, mas que o façam com grande qualidade e com muita ambição, naturalmente. Que os seus projetos se consigam concretizar e que todos nós nos orgulhemos desses mesmos projetos, todos por fazer parte também deste grupo em que todos também queremos aprender com este novo curso. Acreditamos que em conjunto todos nós possamos criar um elo que irá, de certo modo, promover e irá consolidar a investigação, em que nos possamos sempre rever e, naturalmente, orgulhar para prestígio das nossas instituições, da Universidade Autónoma e do Instituto Politécnico de Tomar. Naturalmente que aprenderemos com a diversidade que este curso nos trará e com o contributo que cada um de nós poderá ter. Uma segunda palavra agora para os nossos docentes. Tal como nós, com entusiasmo, todos e empenho, nos acompanharam desde o primeiro momento e que nos apoiaram em todas as diligências com os seus inestimáveis contributos, que melhoraram naturalmente e significativamente a qualidade para que levássemos a bom termo este projeto. Aos nossos colegas da acreditação que nos aconselharam e ajudaram na complexa constituição e construção do processo. Aos nossos colaboradores, nomeadamente da Secretaria dos Doutoramentos, da Unidade de Apoio de Ensino à Distância da UAL e do Laboratório de Inovação Pedagógica e Educação à Distância do IPT. sempre, incansavelmente, nos apoiaram para que todo o processo decorra com normalidade. Contamos com eles, naturalmente, para a boa continuidade deste curso. Por fim, uma palavra final de reconhecimento também aos nossos dirigentes de ambas as instituições, que desde o primeiro momento não apenas acreditaram neste programa, como nos apoiaram, incentivaram e disponibilizaram todos os meios para que pudéssemos agora concretizar. Este curso é de todos nós. E apenas com todos nós o poderemos concretizar em sucesso. Por isso contamos todos os dias com todos os que aqui referenciamos. Alunos, docentes, colaboradores. Dos alunos aos nossos colegas da administração, com quem constituímos sempre uma equipe única em que depositamos toda a nossa confiança e todo o nosso empenho. Vamos dar o primeiro passo. O nosso sucesso será quando todos os alunos defenderem as suas teses. Aí será exatamente os nossos benefícios e os nossos resultados. E quando a sociedade reconhecer cada um destes contributos em favor daquilo que é e entendemos como a ciência. Este doutoramento é uma nova experiência que associa uma universidade privada a um instituto público, num modelo de ensino à distância. Pioneiro nesta dimensão e, naturalmente, no nosso país. E por isso nos orgulhamos imenso por isso. Temos a pretensão de criar e qualificar quadros de especialidade em contexto de investigação, naturalmente, nomeadamente de acordo com os centros de investigação e as cátedras que também estão associadas a este curso. O curso pretende preparar os doutorandos para a sua autonomia, autoaprendizagem, desenvolvimento de competências transversais com foco no trabalho, sobretudo no trabalho de equipa e na partilha. Irá decorrer em torno de dimensões completamente, num conjunto de dimensões inovadoras. Tecnologia, património e território. Pela primeira vez somos capazes disso e seremos capazes disso. Está dirigido para a valorização, para a formação avançada e para a partilha do conhecimento. É uma experiência em que todos acreditamos e queremos acreditar. E vamos, com certeza, ter esses resultados no futuro. Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado, Sr. Reitor. Muito obrigado, Professor João Coroado, por esta oportunidade. Eu dou agora a palavra ao meu colega, Telmo Pereira.
Olá, boa tarde a todos. Eu sou conhecido de tagarela, mas nestas ocasiões sou mais de prática do que de palavras, mas tenho aqui algumas ideias que queria passar. Em primeiro lugar, quero começar por dizer olá a todos, principalmente olá a todos os alunos. E bem-vindos ao Doutoramento em Património, Tecnologia e Território. Eu não tenho muito mais para dizer para algo daquilo que já foi dito. Quero reforçar os agradecimentos que já foram feitos a todos os que ajudaram a chegar até aqui, todos os que contribuíram para a conceptualização do programa, que fizeram críticas, debateram no projeto para ver se ele era realmente sólido, que se disponibilizaram para ser docentes, que ajudaram a carregar informação nas plataformas, que criaram todo um ambiente online, que nos deram formação à distância e ainda a todos os que agora não estou a esquecer, mas que executaram outras tarefas que nos permitiram chegar até este momento, até esta tarde. Quero também agradecer a todos os que nos ajudarão daqui por diante, porque, apesar do processo de construção deste doutoramento ter durado cerca de 2 anos, pode não parecer, mas isto demorou praticamente 2 anos a ser construído, agora é que vai começar. Felizmente, todos os que estão envolvidos, quer da Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa, quer do Instituto Politécnico de Tomates, estão comprometidos com o sucesso e, obviamente, que esse sucesso vai acontecer, porque é essa a nossa prática. Como já foi dito, esta combinação de um doutoramento que integra uma universidade privada com um Instituto Politécnico, ainda por cima à distância, é algo de absolutamente novo, é inédito, nunca tinha sido feito antes. E é aqui, na inovação que faz a diferença, que nós gostamos de estar. Nós gostamos de fazer coisas novas, coisas diferentes, coisas provocadoras, coisas que alteram o panorama, que alteram o paradigma, revolucionam o saber e, principalmente, revolucionam a forma de construir o saber. É isso que vamos conseguir. Que vocês vão conseguir. Os investigadores que se debruçam sobre as formas, os locais e as condições onde as inovações que fazem diferença surgem têm demonstrado vezes em conta que as grandes mudanças de paradigma ocorrem exatamente em locais onde o ambiente é diversificado. Locais onde é possível criar ligações entre objetos, ideias e pessoas, por vezes muito distintas entre si, e que por isso mesmo, quando juntas, geram algo que nunca havia sido criado antes e onde o resultado final é maior do que a soma das partes. É isso que vai aqui acontecer. O doutoramento em Património, Tecnologia e Território mistura o público com o privado, o universitário com o politécnico, o nacional com o internacional, a investigação com a gestão, e onde se encontra um leque de docentes, do aluno e pessoa ao técnico, com abordagens de meio e perspectivas tão distintas entre si, que constitui exatamente um desses ambientes ideais que potenciam a criatividade e a inovação. É isso que temos para nos oferecer. Vamos lá fazer a diferença. E é isto.
Obrigado, Sr. Telmo Pereira, também coordenador deste projeto, juntamente com o Sr. Luís Osterbeck e comigo. Obrigado pelas suas palavras de entusiasmo. As palavras de entusiasmo que são realmente importantes neste momento, porque é esse entusiasmo que nós temos e que está patente sempre e que tentamos e iremos sempre tentar transmitir aos nossos alunos. É um entusiasmo por aquilo que fazemos, por aquilo que gostamos e aquilo que queremos. Obrigado, professor Telmo. Dou agora a palavra ao nosso diretor do departamento, o professor Frederico Vidal, que nos apoiou desde sempre, desde o início da constituição e da proposta deste doutoramento. Professor Frederico.
Muito obrigado, Adolfo. Você é muito breve. Gostaria primeiro de cumprimentar e agradecer a presença do Sr. Reitor da Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa, do Sr. Presidente do Instituto Politécnico de Tomar, cumprimentar os meus colegas fundadores do curso do doutoramento em Património, Tecnologia e Território, o professor Adolfo Silveira, o professor Luís Osterbeck, o professor Telmo Pereira, cumprimentar e agradecer também a presença dos diferentes professores da UAL, do IPT, agradecer e cumprimentar também os conferencistas e, finalmente, os alunos deste primeiro curso de doutoramento. Sejam muito bem-vindos nas nossas instituições. Desejo a todas e todos muita felicidade neste percurso que começa hoje. Na qualidade de diretor do Departamento em História e Humanidades, é um enorme prazer que tomo a palavra nesta sessão de abertura. O meu antecessor nessas funções, o professor Miguel Faria, não pode estar presente conosco hoje, está numa conferência em Coimbra, e também manda cumprimentos a todos, e nós os dois, com um grande apreço em que apoiamos esta proposta, em que transitou entre as duas direções, esta proposta de novo programa de doutoramento, e consideramos como exemplar, de facto, já foi dito, há vários títulos. Primeiro, temos da cooperação institucional, ao longo deste longo processo, de facto, mais de 2 anos, demos conta da qualidade, da solidez da relação entre a UAL e o IPT, mas também das relações pessoais entre as duas equipas de professores, que partilharam ao longo dos últimos anos vários projetos inovadores, tanto em termo pedagógico como em termo científico. E também não posso deixar de frisar a originalidade do projeto científico-pedagógico que sustenta este novo programa de doutoramento à distância, e, nomeadamente, como já também foi dito, do ponto de vista do diálogo e da convergência entre as ciências sociais e humanas e outras áreas do conhecimento. Queria acabar esta breve intervenção com uma nota mais pessoal, a satisfação, enquanto diretor deste departamento, de ver este projeto reforçar a nossa oferta de formação avançada no terceiro ciclo e complementar o outro doutoramento que temos em História. Então, desejo a todos e a todas uma excelente sessão inaugural e, mais uma vez, aos alunos, bem-vindos e bom caminho da investigação connosco. Estamos cá, como também foi dito, para apoiar o que for necessário, estamos todos cá para apoiar ao longo dos próximos tempos.
Muito obrigado. professor Frederico Vidal. Dou agora a palavra ao professor Luís Osterbeck, que está a fazer. Luís, estás-nos a ouvir? Claro que sim.
Eu peço desculpa porque eu preciso de ajustar aqui os computadores para que isto funcione.
O professor Luís Osterbeck está a trabalhar
Estão a ouvir?
com computadores ao mesmo tempo. Conseguimos muito bem, professor.
Ok. Então, muito boa tarde. I will switch to English now because I'm supposed to build the bridge with our guest speakers this afternoon. I would like, in any case, to start reinforcing what my colleagues already said in terms of acknowledgement of the support from both IPT and Autonomous University of Lisbon to this project. Apart from all the colleagues that have been mentioned, I would like to say that it has been a very interesting experience because we are two different institutions, of course, in many respects, but the personal interaction was from the very first minute excellent. I remember the first conversation I had in Lisbon with the then director of the department, Professor Miguel Faria, and then later on the lengthy discussions with the team of UAL, particularly with Professor José Subtil and Telma Ruas, and of course my colleagues Telmo and Adolfo in the preparation of this program. And I think this environment of working together with different perspectives, with different insights, has been particularly interesting. Now, this program is not a mere academic degree. This is not our aim. Our aim is to expand the network of researchers that collaborate with the two research centers that support the PhD program, which is the Geosciences Center, which is based at IPT, and also TechniArt, the Technology, Conservation and Enhancement of the Arts Center. In both of them, there is a participation of IPT and UAL researchers and professors. There are also two chairs associated to this, the UNESCO chair on Humanities and Cultural Integrated Landscape Management and the chair on History and Culture of Luso-Brazilian environments, which is based at UAL. And then on base of this collective of researchers that engage many other colleagues, we have a certain number of research lines. Ecodynamics of prehistoric and ancient societies, rock art, underwater archaeology, ancient technologies. These are some of the lines in the field fundamentally of archaeology, but also cultural landscapes management, environment, mountain environment studies, landscape, cultural landscapes and landscape management, interaction with UNESCO programs like REGIS and geoparks, and so on, and which are more in the line of cultural landscapes itinerary of the PhD program. So it is a research-oriented program. All the colleagues that now join it as students of the program, they are colleagues that will reinforce this research, that will help us to build more knowledge in these domains. We count with a very large set of researchers all across the world. We will listen to one of them in a few minutes, John Crowley, but you see online, for example, Professor Harold Schurzen, who won't be speaking today, but he is a very close colleague and friend in our research. And this is what we aim at. So very soon, we will organize research teams engaging scholars and research students in some of these lines. And the PhD, which is a 4 years program, has a very clear chronogram with deliverables which are also very clear. In the first semester, will allow to clarify the topic of each dissertation and also to detail all the materials and methods components. The second semester will allow to write in detail the programming and the logical framework for the remaining 3 years, so that by the end of the first year, all the basics, including hands-on training on some specific analytical tools, etc., will be completed, and research papers and finally the thesis will be obtained. Now, I know that most of you present, certainly in the room where I sit, are not here to listen to me. They are here basically to listen to John and Lawrence. So I would like to introduce you, although he is already quite well known, John Crowley. John Crowley has been collaborating with the Geosciences Center and our research units at Mação for quite a while. He has had very relevant responsibilities in the framework of UNESCO, and in that condition, we worked together in many domains, particularly for the preparation of the World Humanities Conference. But before that, he had largely contributed to reorganize the interaction of UNESCO with the sector of social sciences, and he was also crucial in the reorganization of the human sciences domain with SIPSH, and particularly the establishment of the new UNESCO program, Bridges, which is a humanities-led program on sustainability, if we want to put it in a simple sentence. More recently, John has started a new domain of activity which engages an interest on also the environment, although he already had that, but particularly energy issues as well, not only the cultural heritage, and also bridging with the private sector, which is a challenging initiative, which we all hope will continue to be very successful. And of course, I'm very grateful to John for his availability to be with us, knowing this very difficult set of activities. So John, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's a great pleasure to be with you online. I hear quite a lot of echo. I don't know if that can be turned off. I'm feeding back through someone's open microphone. Let me try that again. Perfect. Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you for the invitation to address you this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be associated with this new program and to have the opportunity to say some words in introducing it. And thank you very much, Luis, also for your kind words about everything we've achieved in the past, in particular during my time at UNESCO. What I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon is the question of the past and the future from an Orwellian perspective, the perspective of George Orwell. I'm assuming knowledge of George Orwell, rightly or wrongly, his style, his purpose, and in particular knowledge of perhaps his most famous work, the novel 1984. Assuming knowledge of that particular novel is probably quite reasonable in a context such as this. I'd be very surprised if anyone were to tell me, if we were sitting in the room together, sorry, no, never heard of it. Whether everyone is familiar with George Orwell more generally is a bit of an open question. And certainly if you look at the way Orwell is represented on social media these days, almost entirely through the medium of 1984, you sometimes have the impression that people have read the book or read selected quotes from the book, but actually have no idea who the author was. That's not very important for this particular presentation, though I will come back to it briefly later. 1984, as you know, I won't give an extensive plot summary, is the story of a totalitarian regime and one individual's attempt to revolt against it, an attempt that ends with failure. The totalitarian regime is called Oceania. It is, the novel suggests, basically the English-speaking world, North America and the United Kingdom. The novel is set in London, indeed, but it's very clear that the rest of Europe is part of a different geopolitical entity called Eurasia, about which the novel says nothing except that it exists. And in this thoroughly dystopian society, set imaginatively in 1984, the novel, as you probably know, was written in 1948 and published in early 1949. Oceania is governed by a ruling party called simply the party, by an ideology called INGSOC, short for English Socialism, and by a mythical leader. No one's sure whether he as leader actually exists as a person or whether he's merely the symbol of the party and its ideology, called Big Brother. And the revolt against this totalitarian system is the revolt of an individual called Winston Smith, who is driven to oppose the system and ultimately be destroyed by it by two things. And the two things are very interesting. One, I will discuss in a lot of detail, the other not, but it's good to keep both things in mind. The two things that lead him to revolt are love and the past. He ends up failing, and indeed, between love and the past, he is forced to choose love, love of Big Brother. The final words of the novel being precisely, he loved Big Brother, at which point the story is over. But basically the whole thrust of the novel, both as a novel, in terms of the action or the plot, and as a philosophical exercise in reflecting on the nature of political power, is essentially connected to Winston's relation to the past. Hence the fact that talking about past and future in terms of 1984 is, I think, a very relevant and very instructive exercise. It's important to note in terms of Orwell's purpose, which is often not fully recognized when the novel is quoted, that he was above all a satirist. He was a great admirer of Jonathan Swift, for instance. And the purpose of satire in Swift, as in Orwell, is not to predict the future, but to exaggerate certain trends and certain features of the present, 1948 in this case, in order to reveal their inner logic. Not to say what will happen, but to say what the present means if we try to understand it deeply, and if to exercise our imagination, to get beyond some of the superficial features of the world in which we live, we push its characteristic features as far as they can possibly go. And as many commentators on the novel have noted, basically everything Orwell describes in his Oceania, every aspect of the party that he invents, is effectively a combination of Stalinist Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany, pushed to the logical conclusion and turned into something much more systematic than either of those regimes actually was in reality. The novel has produced many memorable phrases, often turned into memes on social media, sometimes memes created by people who clearly have no idea what they're quoting from. Among those memorable phrases, there is one I'd like to focus on, which, as many of you will have guessed, is the point of my title. This is the following quote, which is one of the slogans of the party. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. Controlling the past, controlling the future is both how the party exercises its hegemony and the reason for exercising hegemony in the first place. And Winston quotes this slogan in the course of his own musings about memory, history, the past, and what it is to be human. And Orwell, through the words of Winston, reflects to a considerable extent on the way in which memory, history, and the past connect to what it is to be human. And Winston is particularly sensitive to this, those familiar with the novel will recall, because his job in the official newspaper of the regime, which Orwell provocatively calls The Times, just as in the London of his own day, is to rewrite the past every day in order to ensure that it fits the needs of the present. Any prediction or statement made in the past by the party must be eternally true, which means that if the party got it wrong last year or 10 years ago, that past has to be rewritten in order to ensure that the party has always been right. And that task of rewriting, including rewriting yesterday's newspapers to fit in with today's idea of what is correct, is what Winston spends his day doing. He and many others, of course. Now, on its face, this party slogan looks like something like a template for a constructivist utopian project. Controlling the past is a means to controlling the future, and controlling the future is the whole point of the political project. And this is true at one level of analysis, but at the same time, like much else in the novel, like many of the party's slogans, it's also deeply misleading and self-contradictory. The most famous of the slogans, engraved in enormous letters on the column on the front of the party headquarters, slavery is freedom, or freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and so on, are deliberately self-contradictory slogans adopted as such in the name of an ideology that the party promotes of so-called doublethink. And as we will see, and this is interesting, very interesting in terms of the kinds of issues that a program such as this needs to explore, the slogan, "He who controls the past controls the future, he who controls the present controls the past," is itself an exercise in doublethink, deliberately misleading and self-contradictory, inviting the loyal party member to think two incompatible things at the same time. And therefore, by rejecting any idea of objective truth or even simple semantic coherence, to create the space for absolute political domination. As Hannah Arendt, whom Orwell didn't know because her Origins of Totalitarianism was published contemporaneously with 1984, but whose thought intersects in very many ways with the thought of George Orwell, emphasized, the point of totalitarianism is not to tell lies and to be expected to be believed and to expect to be believed. It is to erase the very idea of truth, which means that because nothing is true, nothing is a lie either. In the same way, and this is something Orwell says explicitly in the novel, in the same way that in Oceania, nothing is illegal because there aren't any laws. There's a close parallel, obviously, between these 2 points. And Winston comes to realize the misleading and self-contradictory nature of the party's slogan through his own engagement with the past. Again, fans of the novel, or those who simply remember it well, will know that his personal engagement with the past, his ideological revolt against the party, comes from the chance circumstance that led him at one point to have in his hands a copy of a photograph, which by some miracle had not been altered by the party, that showed the party's discourse to be a lie, something that proved that the past had been altered because it was a residue of the past prior to its alteration. And this existential moment in his life leads him to be deeply interested in the past in ways that can only lead him on a collision course with the party of which he is a very minor and very junior member. This engagement with the past takes two forms, both of which, as we will see, are very interesting for the broader subject that I'd like to discuss here. First, memory. But this turns out to be deeply frustrating and ultimately fruitless. Winston's attempts to recover his own memories turn out to be of little value. His memories are incomplete and unreliable. He has no direct personal access through memory to a time before the rule of the party, including because he was a child at the time. He tries, therefore, to rescue memories to which he doesn't have personal access by engaging with a member of the proletarian class, the proles, the non-members of the party, the majority of the population, over which the party exercises absolute domination. But his attempts to engage in a pub with an old man who has or should or be expected to have personal memories of life before the party turn out to be radically unsatisfactory too. Memory has been erased, not literally in the sense that people have become amnesiacs, but in the sense that there is no social basis for the maintenance of memory, and therefore memory becomes simply random collections of anecdotes. Secondly, partly as a response to this disappointment of the engagement through memory, Winston engages in the past or with the past through artifacts, and in particular two artifacts that become symbolic and metonymic of his relationship to the past and his attempt to undo the ideological domination of the party. On the one hand, a notebook, which he happens to find in a secondhand shop, a notebook with real paper, for which he manages to acquire a real fountain pen and ink. Not entirely clear how, but doesn't matter. These are the MacGuffins, as Alfred Hitchcock famously said, that make the story possible, and a paperweight that he discovers in an antique shop. A paperweight which he finds beautiful, but in addition to its beauty, he finds it important because it has survived unaltered from a past that has not been rewritten to give it contemporary meaning, but simply exists as part of the present. Of course, the paperweight is hidden in his drawer, as is the notebook, but survives in the present as an item, a trace of an objective past. And as Winston puts it on several occasions, if the past survives in objective form, it is through artifacts that have retained their integrity, artifacts that haven't been modified, rewritten, erased, or effaced to fit the needs of the present. And yet these objects inherently are divorced from meaning because they are detached from memory. There's no way of knowing what the paperweight means, where it came from, who made it, how it was transmitted. It simply is. And in that respect, artifacts and memory should be working together, but in the social conditions of Oceania in 1984, they can't. They are mere tokens of a past that is essentially out of reach. From the limitations inherent in these forms of ultimately futile engagement comes Winston's realization that in the party's world, past and future are not controlled, not really, despite the slogan. They are erased, precisely because they cannot be controlled. For the past to exist means recognizing the existence of artifacts that can circulate without alteration, possibly also without meaning, but at least without alteration. Recognizing the past as past, in other words, is recognizing its unalterability, its objective nature in Orwell's terminology, which we might find epistemologically naive these days from a social science or humanities perspective, but was still very central to the way in which he himself wrote. Not, of course, even in Orwell's thinking, because the past is fully known or immune to interpretation. On the contrary, it's the limits of knowledge and the provisional, contestable nature of interpretation that mark the past as something more than what we think or say it to be. And conversely, it is the party's claim to say what the past is, and indeed to create it for its own purposes, that denies the existence of the past as past, that erases it. Which echoes, you may have noted, with a very famous quote from William Faulkner, who said in one of his novels that the past is not dead, it's not even past. Writing about a part of the United States in his fictional Mississippi that was dominated by a past that was unable ever quite to pass. Erasure of the past is the only way of ensuring that the past remains safely past, safely dead as past, and therefore denying it as past. And similarly, symmetrically, recognizing the future as future is recognizing its radical non-existence. The fact that it exceeds control beyond the trivial short-term instrumental predictions that are embedded in direct manipulation. I can plan this lecture in a certain way. I can shape my immediate future over a couple of hours and perhaps shape yours too, condemned to listen to me. Just like when we throw a ball or flip a switch or book a ticket, we are to some extent shaping certain limited aspects of the future. But these acts of micro-control don't control the future. They merely make some small aspects of it present, and they cannot, by their very nature, be extrapolated, scaled up, or generalized. And we might add a good thing too. All of this leads Winston in the novel to a very striking observation which deserves to be quoted in full. He says, writes as follows, talking about the world in which he lives, Oceania in 1984. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. An endless present, not control of the past or of the future, but erasure of the past and the future in favor of the creation of an endless present. This is the contradiction, the doublethink in the party's slogan. For the past to be controlled, it must cease to exist. Maybe less obvious for the future, but I'll come to that in a second. You will note, incidentally, that the word statue in the first sentence that I just quoted points to one of the reasons why Orwell is currently a very popular reference for the reactionary right of the political spectrum on social media in particular. People who regard constructive reinterpretation of statues in whatever form that might take as being something that violates the sanctity of the past and is supposedly introducing some Orwellian project of social control. The fact that Orwell himself, as I'm sure all of you know, was a lifelong democratic socialist is one of the interesting ironies in the way he has become a posthumous standard bearer for a certain kind of reactionary right. Put that aside as a parenthesis. So, that the party erases the past rather than controlling it is clear enough. It may seem less obvious, as I said, that the future is also being erased. After all, many aspects of the party's plan for society in the novel are explicitly constructive. There is a plan to generalize and systematize the use of newspeak, the form of language characteristic of Oceania that is designed to limit, restrict, and ultimately prohibit thought. The abolition of the orgasm, as perhaps jokingly put by O'Brien, the inner party character who entraps and tortures Winston Smith in the novel as a horizon for the transformation of humanity that is necessary for the permanence, the indefinite permanence of the party's rule. Yet, Winston observes, while still in his rebel mode, the decline of technological progress in Oceania. The future is being technologically closed by indifference to science and technology, embedded in the logic of pure political control. And when he's given access to the mysterious forbidden book, which describes the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism, as the book is called, given by O'Brien for the purposes, among other things, of entrapment, he understands, or at least sees a rather sophisticated analysis of the fact that the whole purpose of this oligarchical collectivism, as it's called, is to stop the pendulum of political change, to end history, not just in the sense popularized by Francis Fukuyama in the 1990s, history as capital H grand narrative of ideological conflict, but more profoundly, history in the sense of anything whatsoever happening. Beyond the full realization of INGSOC, English socialism, lies nothing. Nothing. It is a utopia that is entirely devoid of content. The party is creating a world in which nothing henceforth will ever happen. And O'Brien, as the voice of the inner party, the voice of the intellectual dimension of oligarchical collectivism, recognizes in his discussions with Winston Smith, in between torturing him physically and mentally, the endless present extends also into the future, not just with respect to the past. And O'Brien gives Winston a dramatic statement of this future as endless present, another phrase that's very often quoted from the novel. If you want a picture of the future, O'Brien says to Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Now, there are two angles to this. One is obviously, why would the picture of the future be a picture of sadistic persecution? But almost more interesting is the way in which the sentence ends, forever. Only one thing happens, which is another way of saying that nothing happens. Now, this is satire, of course. Orwell is underlining the absurdities of utopian thinking by this dystopian trope of the ultimately undesirable future. A utopia is essentially a kind of eschatological fantasy, one in which, all ends having been achieved, there is nothing left to do. One in which humanity has effectively abolished itself by realizing itself. The pendulum stops, as does any kind of dialectic. But the satire, pushing things to the logical and at the same time absurd conclusion, also shows the lie or the doublethink at the heart of the party slogan. The future isn't controlled any more than the past is. It is abolished, at least as project, as idea. And there's an interesting paradox here. This is that an eternal present in which nothing happens, a system in a state of maximum entropy, is the ultimate form of sustainability, in the literal meaning of the word sustainability. And yet, at the same time, it is clearly a nightmare, and it's sustainability in the service of nothing, achieving nothing, producing nothing, allowing nothing to emerge. This is ultimately the characteristic of a state of maximum entropy, thermodynamic equilibrium in an isolated system. Once it's reached that point, nothing further can change. Which means, and this is the point that I would certainly want to emphasize, that freeing sustainability from stasis is perhaps the basic Orwellian thought about sustainability. And indeed, this chimes with Orwell's thoughts about environmentalism and environmental issues, which are admittedly a bit scattered. They were not the leading issues of his time. He wasn't personally specifically committed to them, and he was extremely hostile to the environmentalists of his day as a political force. But nonetheless, his thoughts on these issues are fundamentally anti-industrial on both moral and aesthetic grounds, grounds that he shared with many conservatives of his day and of earlier days back to the middle of the 19th century. Orwell observed fundamental transformations which he felt to be negative because they destroyed what was valuable in the past, irreplaceable things of beauty, and the emphasis on beauty is important in Orwell's work. The famous paperweight, which I mentioned earlier, is valued, among other things, because it is beautiful. And by destroying those valuable things from the past, undermining their own material and symbolic conditions of reproduction, reducing human life to the boot stamping on the human face, as if everything else had to be eliminated in order to make that perfectly sustainable non-future, that endless present of persecution, viable and sustainable. There are many examples scattered through Orwell's writings. In 1984 itself, the emphasis on the ugliness of the physical environment and the tastelessness of food, but also the famous scene in the novel Coming Up for Air, published in 1939, where the protagonist visits a place of idealized natural beauty from his childhood and discovers it destroyed and disfigured by the construction of a housing estate, or the way in which the bodily sacrifice of the miners in The Road to Wigan Pier is framed in the discussion, even though The Road to Wigan Pier is not a novel, as a kind of almost blood sacrifice to the dark gods of industrialism, encoding in the bodies of the miners the symbolic structural violence of the system itself. At the same time, he was, as the whole novel shows, acutely sensitive to the fundamental inhumanity of a world without change. So if change is perceived to be mostly bad as a fact, not by the nature of change, but by the nature of the circumstances in which it took place during the Industrial Revolution and extending into war period and the Second World War, including by transforming the conditions of war, of human inhumanity towards other humans by the power of technology. The answer is not to stop things changing, but to think differently about the possibilities of change. And I think we can argue, though he didn't say so very explicitly in his own writings, that for Orwell, the objective reality of the past and the imaginative openness of the future were intimately and organically connected. And possibly I'm interpreting his writings in that way simply because I happen to agree with that myself. So let's say that it's an Orwellian view, which I'm expressing based on Orwell, rather than necessarily Orwell's view of things that he wasn't necessarily aware of, he came too early, and which he was perhaps a bit too conservative, despite being a democratic socialist. For him, there was no contradiction to endorse. But his writings, I think, still open the right doors that can be very useful to us in thinking about these issues today. To put it very simply, sustainability is sustainability of a future still unwritten, anchored in a living past. There are two paradoxes there: the idea that we can think about the future even though it doesn't have a script, and the idea that we can relate to a past that is supposedly unalterable and objective in something like Orwell's sense, while still recognizing that our relation to the past is a living relation of appropriation, imagination, and reinterpretation. And that's what I'd like to discuss in the closing section of this talk. In particular, what does this approach mean for the kinds of themes that are relevant to this program? Themes of landscape and territory, identity, artifacts, memories, new infrastructures and planning processes, innovative practices, beauty, performance, representation. Rather random list of words, others could be added, but something like the concatenation of those ideas and that vocabulary maps the space within which people doing doctoral work, and in particular doctoral research in this program, will be engaged. The key points I'd like to emphasize in this regard are imagination, co-construction, and emergence as they connect to the relation between past and future. To recognize that the past exists objectively is to emphasize the existence of raw material, shall we say. Things that, like the paperweight in 1984, just happen to be there, regardless of exactly where they come from, because knowing that requires work, and regardless of exactly what we do with them. They have an existence which is their own, whether we're talking about buildings, used buildings or ruined buildings, landscapes, however natural they may seem to be, and however unaware we might be until we do the work of the historical process of construction from which they have emerged. Texts, stories, images, again, which circulate sometimes without context, but which we can both relate to as they stand and study and enrich through knowledge of where they come from and interpretation of what they might mean. The raw material is there. It offers the basis on which we can do productive, creative work on this raw material. Indeed, as Orwell emphasizes, particularly in reference to the famous paperweight, which again is an object, but also a metaphor and a metonym for the past, there is a need, a yearning, perhaps a duty to preserve this raw material, to enhance and enrich it, and thereby to make it available for study and reinterpretation. The constant work on the past, both what we were already aware of through our existing legacies and what we discover anew, whether as archaeologists digging in the soil, as archival researchers finding new texts and images in some repository, or as social researchers asking questions and getting people to speak and capturing aspects of the society in which we live, thereby producing more material for ourselves and our future selves to study, we are effectively making the past a living past. Now, this may sound a bit like erasing the past as objective, inalterable reality. In fact, it's the opposite. It is the living past as past recaptured, reinterpreted, transformed, enriched, and made part of life that keeps it alive as past. On one condition, that its past lives are available to be reinterpreted. The erasure in the party's domination. Thank you, Luis. I noted that I need to wind up. That's absolutely fine. The erasure in the party's domination is not simply the erasure of the past, but of the discourses of the past about the past. That's what creates this eternal, endless present. Similarly, whereas the only way to control the future is to erase it, and the only way to try to control it is to colonize it, the only way to sustain it is to open it as a living future, just like the living past, which takes place in the present. Just as the past exists by being appropriated in the present, recognizing its objective reality. Similarly, the future exists in the present by being appropriated, recognizing its complete absence of objective reality, precisely because the future hasn't happened yet. In other words, the present is the only place where humans can act, imagine, create, build, whatever else, but it's not the only place in which we live. In acting in the present, we live in the continuum, the imaginative continuum of present, past, and future as lived present experience, from which the future emerges, not unconnected to our plans and desires, but never determined or controlled by them, whether individually or collectively. And sustainability is, to this extent, I think, best seen as sustainability of this lived past and this lived future, which are closely connected to one another because each is the possibility of the other. In other words, as inscription in the present of the uncontrolled timeline through which life achieves continuity and meaning. By contradistinction with the world of 1984, where the fantasy of controlling the timeline, thereby erasing the present, erasing the past and the future, as lived experience, deprives life of continuity and meaning. This may all seem a bit abstract and artistic, but I think it has a very practical thrust. If one thinks of the ways in which infrastructures in particular relate to the spaces they occupy, both physical and imaginary spaces, building codes and water management systems, forests, commercial exploitation, energy production, transport, all of these use the raw material of the past, including the distant geological past of the planet, and by using it, transform it, make it present, and leave it to the future in altered state, thus shaping future conditions of habitability, flourishing, and ongoing emergence. There is a temptation to want to erase the traces of the past in order to open up the future. And there is a temptation, perhaps to the point of extinction, as is currently fashionable in some environmental philosophy, to leave no trace in order to keep the future open. But in that case, not for us, since we have been extinguished. I think the opposite is true. It is by recognizing traces and valuing them that we can create the possibility of genuine sustainability. With that, time is up. I will close. There could be a lot more to say on the subject, but I hope you found these thoughts at least interesting, and perhaps they've stimulated you not just to reread 1984, but to go look at some of Orwell's other writings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for this very, very interesting approach. And I'm sure there would be many colleagues interested in raising questions, including myself. But what we will do, given the time, is I hope you can stay with us. And in that case, we can have some discussion in the end. But
I'm happy to stay.
I would now immediately go to introducing our next speaker. Professor Lawrence Strauss. Lawrence is emeritus professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. He has conducted research on prehistoric, mainly Upper Paleolithic context, but also later Mesolithic contexts in various places, but particularly in Iberia, in the Iberian Peninsula. He has, and this was possibly the main reason why we considered inviting him, and he was very generous to accept. He has a long research with a remarkable profile in terms of publications, supervising research of many younger colleagues. and he has came across the evolution of methods and analytical tools in archaeology, and also epistemological approaches. Also, a large part of his approach, of his itinerary, I think converges very much with the approach of this doctoral program, which has a strong accent on materialities. This is why we stress the words technology and territory. And there is a further reason to have invited Lawrence Strauss, who is also Leslie Spear Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, is a quote. I will read it, that his students made on a tribute to his career and his support. And they said students should follow their own interests and dreams. This is the quote of Lawrence. I subtly guide them, provide ideas, references, advice, and stimulation. One should correct, critique, but doggedly support and never force students to toe a personal line on issues. And I thought this was a good advice that we that have the responsibility now of this new doctoral program should follow in relation to our own students. So, Lawrence, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours. It's yours.
Boa tarde. Obrigado. Unfortunately, my Portuguese is limited and very rusty at this point. Love Portugal very much, and very much wish I were with you in Tomar or Lisbon. Nonetheless, here I am in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque spelled the way your grand captain, Alphonse d'Albuquerque, was spelled. Now, as Monty Python would say, for something completely different. First of all, Luigi, can you hear me? Okay. A word about myself as a digging archaeologist, specialized in Upper Paleolithic human adaptations along the Atlantic facade of Western Europe, together with some experience in Middle Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic time periods, mostly in caves and rock shelters, over the last 50 years. I regard myself as a non-specialist, organizer of interdisciplinary research projects involving wide varieties of archaeologists, geoarchaeologists, and bioarchaeologists, but with particular personal interests in lithic artifacts, archaeophonas, and chronostratigraphy. As an excavation director, I regard myself as a hands-on archaeological organizer or impresario, committed to using the record better to understand changes and variations in human behavior throughout the course of the late Quaternary, and always open to exploring new avenues for obtaining information relevant to answering questions about past environments, resources, and human adaptations. I have sought to follow a highly collaborative model in the study of sites and regional settlement subsistence systems, and I actively produce, promote, and facilitate publication of both the basic descriptive record and analytical results, including both standard and innovative ones. The remarks that follow are based on my personal experience of 50 years conducting excavations and limited surveys in Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites in Spain, France, Portugal, and Belgium, as well as my familiarity with the state of research in both Europe and, as a longtime professor and journal editor in New Mexico, the United States. They're certainly not representative of the complete situation. biased as they are on my own limited and perhaps jaundiced view of things. In particular, my role as co-director of the El Mirón Cave Prehistoric Project in Cantabrian, Spain, together with Manuel González Morales, since 1996, 27 years now, very much colors my perspective on the state of Stone Age research in Europe. Please pardon my inclination towards pessimism, which may be somewhat excessive. The key role of excavation. Naturally, surface survey and small-scale subsurface testing or coring are important tools in archaeological research, especially to locate sites, to reveal and analyze regional settlement patterns, albeit often at low levels of chronological precision, and to create cultural heritage registries for the sake of preservation and damage mitigation. Together, these methods can be particularly useful in the study of relatively recent periods in regions with good surface visibility, such as the case of the arid American Southwest, where I live, and in regions where geomorphological processes have laid bare extremely old surfaces, such as in the Rift Valley of East Africa. While lithic artifacts are generally present in open-air loci, the preservation of faunal and botanical remains is often uneven or nil, and the possibilities for the mixing of items of greatly differing ages can be great in surface contexts. However, in many cases, such as the Upper Paleolithic of Southwest Europe, the archaeological record is best preserved from erosion, is deeply buried in rock shelters and caves, and generally includes chronometrically datable bioarchaeological remains, and the distributions of both artifacts and other remains may be more or less sealed, in quotes, in place, especially when sedimentation rates were high. Even if Stone Age Pompeii's were rare, or are rare, in both open air and cave settings, with notable exceptions including the famous open-air locus of Pain-Savant, and other Upper Magdalenian sites in northern France, western Switzerland, and the German Rhineland. While test pits, often only about a meter square, are useful to obtain evidence for the presence of archaeological materials to determine stratigraphic sequences, at least in specific small areas of sites, and to obtain samples for dating and other analyses, they can provide very limited and potentially highly skewed representations of site contents, and thus of the full range of human activities. Although it is very rare to be able to excavate a Stone Age site completely or even in very large part, a spectacular example being the Mousterian site of the Abrich Romani in Catalonia, the opening up of large areas is essential to gather information about the spatial distribution of artifacts and faunal remains, to stand a good chance of finding features such as hearths, pits, or burials, and basically to obtain evidence of variability within individual occupation layers, interpretable in terms of the organization of space use within sites. As we know, modern excavation, as opposed to test pit digging, is excruciatingly meticulous and slow, with three-dimensional plotting of most finds above about a centimeter in size, fine mesh water screening, photographic recording, etc., often proceeding by only a few centimeters per week, especially when finds are abundant. Everything is collected under controlled excavation, controlled conditions, which in Paleolithic sites, this means including thousands of very small lithic chipping debris and bone splinters, charcoal fragments, fire-cracked rocks, etc., not just the stone tools and large flakes, obvious osseous artifacts, and easily identifiable bones and teeth. So to be truly meaningful, excavations need to be relatively extensive and prolonged. They require substantial, sustained funding, institutional and infrastructure support, and the long time dedication of project directors and assistants, as well as trained, conscientious dig crew members. Most importantly, projects must have overall scientifically meaningful goals to contribute to the body of knowledge about the behavior, adaptations, and evolution of past humans and societies in specific regional and continental contexts. They should consciously be concerned with addressing specific questions of relevance, both at the level of the site or local area and in a wider realm of scientific interest. Ideally, excavation projects should generate not only descriptive publications of the basic empirical archaeological record, but also diverse specialized analyses, including theses and dissertations. This means the training of new cadres of researchers within university contexts. Excavations and the consequent analyses can take years or decades, and if well done, can involve the revisiting of materials through additional or even new kinds of analyses and resampling of stratigraphic sections long after the end of fieldwork per se. It behooves project directors to stay abreast of new technologies for recording and retrieving information, new avenues and methods of analysis, new possibilities for extracting ever more detailed and esoteric information from sediments and finds, and to contact possible new kinds of collaborating scientists, while maintaining the traditional classic goals and standards of excavation, analysis, publication, and collection curation, and while fully recognizing the ethical obligations of the destructive nature of archaeological fieldwork. The conundrums of excavation. Just as a profession is coming to grips with how complex, expensive, and time-consuming and ethically critical modern excavation should be, it is being faced with several conundrums and partially conflicting agendas. Everywhere, it seems, well, maybe not so much in Germany or maybe Portugal, budgets for archaeology are being cut. And for academic positions, notably tenured professorships and primary research, for both academic positions and primary research. In many cases, university jobs are being eliminated, downgraded, and made ever more onerous in terms of teaching and administration loads, on top of the accelerating publish or perish demands. Publication of research results in high impact, in quotes, international, i.e. English language, semi-monopolistic, multinational corporation-owned journals are increasingly expected by university administrators and national funding agencies and ministries, to the detriment of traditional national, regional, university, or professional society journals. This tends to favor hit and run testing of sites with quick results and exaggerated claims of importance from very limited fieldwork, as opposed to more substantial, substantive, and thoughtful presentation of significant amounts of data that are thoroughly analyzed in the context of culturally meaningful research. In addition to budget cuts, academic job insecurity, and an emphasis on quick, so-called impactful publications, there seem to be increasing bureaucratic obstacles to the conduct of archaeological excavations in many parts of the world. The permitting process is often getting longer and more onerous, and in some cases it has become impossible to actually dig due to the zealous over-application of modern norms of site protection, however well-intentioned and reactive to some of the horrors of past archaeological work that at times verged on looting. University accounting and legal offices sometimes make it materially impossible to conduct excavations because of increasingly restrictive regulations concerning spending and liability risks. The expense of new technologies used in recording, such as laptop computers, software, total stations, high-end cameras, laser-based digital imagery, etc., along with the rising travel, lodging, and food costs, can easily consume tight archaeological budgets and limit the time spent digging and the numbers of excavators. It is not uncommon to see small, short-term excavations endowed with the latest high-tech cameras, topographic instruments, and computers, all for recording very reduced surface areas, stratigraphic sections, and samples of finds during very short field seasons. The products, granting agencies and university administrators now tend to see publications as products, may be very slick in their graphics, but poor in actual results that really demonstrate something of transcendent interest or importance, despite claims of the contrary in the abstracts. A common phenomenon these days are abstracts for professional meetings, often poster prospectuses submitted many months in advance of the actual or online symposia, and even before analyses are completed, that are heavy on theoretically sophisticated generalities, but that deliver very limited results that actually support any definite conclusion. The situation is driven by the rat race that must be run, especially by junior academics seeking jobs, the next grant, teaching contract renewal, professional advancement, or tenure, all in the name of productivity and institutional justification of budgetary support from governments and private funders. I fear that these factors, financial, academic, and administrative, are all combining to make it increasingly hard to conduct successful, large-scale, long-term excavations, the years-long, painstaking analyses of finds, and the traditional publication of the basic records that our discipline and ethics really require. New methods need our excavations. Against this backdrop, the fast-moving development of new, highly technical and sophisticated analyses, especially in the biological sciences, such as ancient DNA from bones and teeth, and now even dental cementum and archaeological sediments and stable isotope analyses, make archaeological sites and their collections the much sought-after targets or mines of researchers in highly funded specialized laboratories and institutes in Europe, Britain, and the United States. While it seems ever harder to conduct substantial excavations with long chronostratigraphic sequences, broad aerial coverage, and good chances for making rare discoveries, such as well-preserved fauna, human remains, and even burials, ornaments, portable artworks, etc., often rather narrowly focused researchers at high-profile laboratories are increasingly on the lookout for well-excavated and chronometrically dated sites to obtain samples. Results can be very spectacular, published in the highest impact international hard science journals, which have very strict length limits. Such articles are generally written in terse style with very technical language. The socioeconomic and cultural aspects of the prehistoric humans who had created the archaeological record are often all but absent from such publications. Genes and isotopes are sometimes reported with very little consideration of broader implications in terms of the past human condition. Cultural aspects of the research are often confined to the bare minimum, while the archaeologists whose years of work to obtain often limited and precarious funding to dig, screen sediments, document and date stratigraphic sequences, and conduct artifact and faunal analyses, and make the finds that can be sampled. Their contributions to these blockbuster articles and the archaeological, i.e. cultural significance can be lost or relegated to brief notes in the supplementary online information. Yet today, it is this kind of article reporting on the latest ancient DNA-based reconstruction of population relationships and movements, or isotopic discoveries on diet or paleotemperature modeling that can be by far the most highly cited publications in an archaeologist's entire career. Lost as just one co-author among many. The increasing interest in computer-enabled modeling has produced many flashy publications, and the authors are now cited as sources of information on human demography and distributions during the particular periods, notably the last glacial maximum or the Neanderthal to Homo sapiens sapiens replacement time. But the models are really only as good as the archaeological sites, their contents, and dates. And these are the fruit not of a few months in the computer lab, but rather of years of excavation and traditional archaeological and paleoenvironmental analyses. They also owe their genesis to the hypotheses and interpretations of archaeologists deeply and broadly familiar with local, regional, and continental records. While not meaning to downplay the extraordinary innovation, complexity, and laboriousness of these new methodologies, sometimes it seems as if the major but more traditional anthropological contributions of excavations that were patiently and meticulously carried out for years by many professional and student archaeologists get buried or forgotten in the focus on spectacular but minimally interpreted results from the novel analytical studies. Archaeologists must be full partners in such specialized research when lab-based experts come in search of good sites and materials to mine. Especially important are the ultimately most important anthropological interpretations and implications of the hard science results. After all, without the excavations and all the basic research they involve, there would be no carefully dated and culturally contextualized sources to be analyzed. In such budgetarily tight times as these, funding agencies must not forget that without good excavations, there will be no meaningful laboratory analyses, no matter how innovative they may be. Who will be the next generation of digging archaeologists? You, perhaps? A corollary to the above is that doctoral students in archaeology are now increasingly steered to actively choose dissertation research that is highly technical and specialized, stressing laboratory analyses rather than the primary collection and study of artifacts. Actual excavation experience, which used to involve many years of de facto apprenticeship. I started at age 14, I'm now 75, is harder to obtain, perhaps for financial reasons, and may be shortened by the need to master complex, specialized analytical methods. The amount of non-excavation, non-artifact-related training now required to do a cutting-edge dissertation can preclude obtaining a deep and broad set of field experiences so important if and when one takes on excavation directorship. Excavation is in great part an art, based often on experience-informed hunches, and it is this aspect of the profession that is in danger of extinction as academia rewards those who are specialists in highly technical but narrow, hard science analytical methodologies. We must always have a central place in academic training and professional development of archaeologists for individuals whose core interest and skills are in excellent excavation. Nevertheless, the education and training of a professional field-oriented archaeologist must include exposure to the interpretive potential, practice, and pitfalls of not only such more traditional subjects as sociocultural and physical and biological anthropology, geomorphology, palynology, archaeozoology, chronometric dating, and statistics, but also newer methodologies such as ancient genomics and stable isotope analyses. The educational load gets ever heavier, but it is necessary if digging archaeologists are to be able constructively to take advantage of the capabilities of myriad analytical specialties while doing so in an intelligent, clear-eyed manner. In addition, reasonably to deal with requests for samples from their sites, archaeologists must actively continue to seek out particular analyses for the purpose of answering their own paleoanthropological questions. Archaeologists must be informed, collaborating, participant consumers of information from specialized analyses. The adoption of the journal impact factor as a key criterion for the acquisition of academic employment, tenure, and promotion would seem to me to work against much traditional archaeological publishing. Few archaeologists, especially junior faculty, get to publish either at all or as principal author in the highest impact international journals, e.g. Nature, Science, PNAS, which never present the basic but all-important results of excavations while tending to showcase the spectacular new discoveries and methodologies, sometimes with slight justification for the conclusions that are speculated upon. Institutions and administrators are abrogating much of the responsibility of evaluating candidates for promotion and tenure to the fallible reviewers of high-impact journals. Many of the highest impact journals that publish on archaeological and human evolution subjects are hard science oriented, so authors have to adopt the style and format of articles in the biological sciences as opposed to a more traditional narrative style. Since many of the journals that are known, or at least perceived to be the sine qua non for academic success, are ones that stress the hard science, often lab-based or modeling-centered aspects of the discipline, doctoral students, postdoctoral researchers, and junior faculty seem to be increasingly pushed into work that does not focus on long-term classic excavation and artifact analysis. Whose heritage and for whom? Ethical archaeologists have always been at the forefront of efforts to protect sites from damage and destruction, often against fierce opposition from economic interests. I don't have to tell people in Portugal about the fight to save the sites at Coa, right? Ironically, however, in many current cases, a major argument for preserving important, highly visible, or spectacular sites is not so much scientific as economic. The creation of magnets for tourism to promote rural sustainability, especially in areas where the traditional agricultural or small-scale industrial base is failing and where depopulation is happening. The justification for cultural heritage preservation, often in instances where sites have been grossly neglected or worse in the past, often boils down to supporting the transition to employment of the population in the hospitality services sector, bars, restaurants, bed and breakfast, hotels, souvenir shops. The supposed economic benefits of the declaration of cultural heritage sites can take precedence over the legitimate needs for ongoing archaeological research. Sometimes, unfortunately, once a monument has been declared, further archaeological excavation becomes increasingly difficult or even impossible as a consequence of long, complex permitting processes that may involve multiple layers of approval or veto. A bureaucratic principle of untouchableness may be applied either by regulation or de facto in practice, thus hindering or preventing research aimed to use the archaeological resource to increase knowledge about the societies and adaptive systems that created the monument in the first place. There can arise the danger of freezing monuments into outdated interpretive schemes, rather than places that can be reasonably queried by new research with innovative theoretical approaches and analytical methods. In many cases, the balance is swung away from scientific research and toward the creation of static monuments whose real purpose, from the political standpoint, is to bring in tourist spending. Reasonable compromises must be struck to permit, facilitate, and fund well thought out, meaningful, innovative research on sites that have cultural heritage protection, while providing mechanism for frequent updating of accurate public interpretation displays in visitor centers and local museums, as well as seriously addressing the criticisms and suggestions of descendant Native communities. The stories told to the public at heritage sites must be subject to revision as research advances. This means that research must continue rather than fossilizing monuments into relating the dogmas current at the time of their discovery and early excavation. While large sums may be spent on visitor centers for monuments, the growing needs of excavation, analysis, curation, and publication must not be ignored, lest research suffer in the quest to create local economic engines based on tourist attractions. Of course, active archaeological excavations should be made accessible to tourists wherever possible, whenever possible, with qualified guides or the archaeologists themselves providing explanations of how the research is done and what is being learned. But monument declaration should not mean the death knell of excavation where it is scientifically justified. The important results of careful excavation and multidisciplinary scientific analyses must be stressed in interpretive displays and pamphlets written for the public, rather than emphasizing just spectacular finds. Education of the public about the key role of archaeological research in learning about the human past in environmental context must be a key role of cultural heritage sites. This should involve the archaeologists themselves, as we must happily fight the Indiana Jones image in popular media. In addition to these considerations, notably in North America and Australia, the rights of indigenous inhabitants, i.e. pre-colonization First Peoples, vis-a-vis archaeological sites that they claim as their ancestral heritage, are increasingly being taken into consideration in decision-making about excavation permitting, even on lands not currently titled to Native groups. At best, consultation with indigenous people and polities can assist and enrich the work of archaeologists. But at worst, from the standpoint of research, requirements for approval by descendant groups, however defined, can complicate or even prevent research. Of course, the debates over the excavation of human remains, associated burial goods, and sacred objects are particularly fraught, and archaeologists, who must be respectful of alternative views of the record, are often caught in the middle. They can be pulled both by the sometimes opposed scientific, professional, and institutional needs to conduct research, and by the ethical obligation to recognize the rise of long overdue need to right historical injustices and the often callous activities and attitudes of past generations of archaeologists. Museums, warehouses of antiquities, or research centers. Another aspect of the archaeological enterprise is that subject to strongly conflicting perspectives and agendas is the museum world. That is subject to strongly conflicting perspectives and agendas is the museum world. Aside from the growing cry for repatriation of illegally or at least unethically acquired artifacts, museums and thus archaeologists are having to deal with the conundrum of how to balance the roles of perpetual pristine conservation versus valid dynamic research. Very often, once artifacts and faunal remains are accessioned into a museum or archaeological repository's collections, as generally required by laws, they become subjected to regulations or simply practices and conditions that make it difficult or impossible for further analysis to be conducted, either by the archaeologists themselves or by specialists in numerous specialized fields of study. The unfortunate effect of an ethos of absolute preservation may mean that finds can become dead objects, prevented from yielding new information, especially as novel methods like DNA or stable isotopes are invented. Even if such methods are minimally destructive, museum curators often adhere to the primate principle of conservation as the rationale for denying sampling requests. Furthermore, many smaller, poorly funded museums lack research labs, equipment, or even space and reasonably long hours of operation to allow outside researchers seriously to study the materials they curate. Even the original excavators may find it hard or impossible to get their own finds back on loan for analysis in their academic labs. A balance needs to be struck between the justifiable need for careful custodianship and the need for continuing research as science advances. Blanket denial of permission to sample or to access collections in the name of preserving the cultural heritage is tantamount to hindering the ongoing dynamic interpretation of the past. If museums are not able to provide good facilities and conditions for time-consuming analyses, agreements between them and the archaeologists, universities should be reached that would allow for long-term curation of collections at the latter, thus making the materials in need of study available by both specialists and students working on theses and dissertations. Unfortunately, interinstitutional rivalries, politics, and regulations can sometimes hinder development of reasonable arrangements for long-term study of collections in academic settings. Finally, museums, as public institutions, are often funded in whole or in part by government money, are torn between their curation and research roles and the perceived need to provide spectacle, to be draws for tourism, especially strong in this post-industrial, leisure-driven age. Museum directors, like archaeologists, must try to balance the political pressure to put on a show that will boost the local economy with the traditional roles of both safeguarding and analyzing collections. The risk of the spectacular is one of oversimplifying or misinterpreting the past. At its worst, museology, like popular archaeological writing, can serve prejudiced or even xenophobic purposes. Museum exhibits must avoid misusing the archaeological record to promote propagandistic stories about the past that distort racial, ethnic, or regional identities. While when governments fund archaeology and museums, there may be at times when politicians, for their own purposes of self-aggrandizement or economic benefit, push for the creation of separatist and supremacist tales based in questionable interpretations of the past, or incorrect interpretations of the past. We have only to consider the history of the 20th century to see how archaeological research, teaching, and museology can be horribly misused. We must be vigilant about how our discoveries and analyses are interpreted in museums, television, textbooks, and now especially the internet. We have ethical obligations to consider how our work is used and abused. Conclusions. I fear I may have been rather pessimistic in my assessment of some of the problems that face traditional excavation-based archaeological research today. As a Paleolithic prehistorian within the interdisciplinary subdiscipline of paleoanthropology who works in Europe, I have not had to deal with issues of indigenous consultation, research restrictions, or even permit vetoes that have long faced my Southwest archaeology colleagues here in the US. I have relied on my Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Belgian colleagues to obtain the necessary authorizations to excavate in their countries and to arrange for the ultimate curation of our finds. However, as a digging archaeologist who has directed or co-directed many excavation projects and as a professor of archaeology, I have confronted and still deal with many of the kinds of dilemmas I have discussed here. There is no doubt that the current situation for archaeologists is far more complex than it was 50 years ago. The explosive development of new methodologies, notably computer-enabled modeling, archaeogenetics, and stable isotopes. The revolution in the for-profit publishing of high-impact international journals that in turn have become the administrator-imposed arbiters of archaeologists' academic careers, increasing bureaucratic permitting hurdles and research regulations, budget tightening, at least in the US, the rise of cultural resource management as a rival to traditional so-called pure research, the increasingly economic justification for cultural heritage designations, demands for premature museum accessioning of collections that subsequently become harder and impossible to keep studying, the changing trends in student dissertation research choices towards narrow specialization. All these have happened during the years of my career. Our profession is beset with many challenges, but our goal to document, interpret, and suggest explanations for past human adaptations and evolution remains central. Conscientious, long-term, meticulous, theoretically justified excavation is at the heart of the archaeological enterprise. What encourages me is the knowledge that there are many young archaeologists who love the combination of serious fieldwork, rigorous analysis, both classic and cutting edge, and dedicated teaching and mentorship. Thus, I salute and encourage you as you undertake your doctoral work in the new PhD program in Heritage, Technology, and Territory. Boa sorte. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for this very challenging and not at all pessimistic approach. I think it is very important to raise these concerns and for people to be aware of the kind of world where we enter. Again, in your case, I would have some questions. I think we must leave them for another occasion. And if you would agree, I will also invite our colleagues to send me eventual questions that I would forward to you and to John Crowley as well. But I do think you have brought exactly the kind of reflection we were hoping for. We think there is room for countering this trend. There are aspects which still make sense, and there are positive elements as well in terms of the number of people doing research and so on. But there is a big danger in trading quality per quantity and trading knowledge per metrics. So thank you very much, Lawrence. Also, thank you, John. As I said, we must now by 5 p.m. in Lisbon, which is exactly now. And I pass on the chair to Adolfo that may conclude the session. Adolfo?
Obrigado a todos pela vossa presença. Foi excepcional esta sessão, que todas as intervenções que aqui foram realizadas tiveram a maior importância. Nós pedimos mesmo que nos deem autorização para poder disponibilizar essas conferências aos nossos alunos. Eu agradeço a todos os presentes, aos alunos em particular que aqui estiveram, aos docentes, e está na hora de começar também a trabalhar. Portanto, amanhã começamos o nosso programa. Conto que todos os alunos estejam presentes no seminário 1, que será coordenado pela professora Graça de Almeida Borges. E muito obrigado a todos e até amanhã. Luís. Luís.
Luís, o microfono bem cumprimenta.
I have to deal with 2 computers at the same time, so it's not an easy task. It's the world of technology. But I was not expecting to speak again. So basically, I endorse what Adolfo said in Portuguese, thanking both John and Lawrence in particular for their intervention, also requiring permission to keep them online for students and people interested to follow. I think you brought very interesting reflections, and we hope to count on both of you for future interactions with our research students in the context of research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao, bello tutto, bella brasserie,
Obrigado. Então, está encerrada a sessão. Obrigado. Até amanhã.